Welcome to Experts and Insights, a close-up look at data protection challenges and solutions. Today's discussion is brought to you by Backbone Software. The worst term in any IT-related scenario is, without a doubt, downtime. It can cripple a business and severely interrupt revenue generation. Today, we will be taking a hard look at how to minimize the impacts of downtime and data loss by planning for and meeting recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives. To illuminate these important issues, we have team coverage from a group of experts. Joining us today, we have Stephen Wynkoop, Microsoft SQL Server MVP, Robbie Wright, Chief Technical Consultant from Abtec, Dennis Martin, President of Demartec, and Mark LeBlanc, Network Specialist at the Edmonton Public Library. To begin, let's start with a definition of recovery time objectives. Let's go to Stephen first.
Well, really the recovery time objectives come back to how much time you can afford to A, be down, and B, how much time you can take to bring things back up.
Dennis, what about recovery point objectives?
So the whole idea of recovery point objective is to say how much of your data do you have to get back so that you can be up and running again. In many cases, it's not all the data, but there's certain data that's been identified as critical.
Is it common for businesses to meet their recovery time and recovery point objectives?
Just because you say you have an RTO or an RPO doesn't mean you have one until you've actually made a plan, executed it, tested it, and make sure that that it can achieve your goals.
Well, bluntly, most businesses don't. Most of them spend a lot of time backing things up, but they don't spend a lot of time figuring out how they're going to recover it.
How can businesses increase the success rate of meeting recovery objectives? Mark, what do you think?
It depends on how you classify your data and how important that data is to your business.
Yes, data classification is a really big deal, especially as the companies get bigger and you find yourselves under some kind of regulatory environment where you've got data compliance issues and government regulations or commercial, credit card regulations, whatever they are. You need to classify the data because some data needs to be kept longer than others, and some data needs to be recovered or backed up differently.
And a lot of times the data is not housed on a particular system. There's a lot of dependencies between systems. So you have to actually spend a lot of time analyzing what data comprises of your entire systems. For example, a web server may have a database backend that gets tied together. If you restore one at a certain point in time and the other at a different point in time, the data is in an inconsistent state. So you really have to look at all of your data and actually analyze how the importance of the data.
If you are in the personnel office and you've got human resource data, HR data, you're going to want to make sure that's pretty well locked down. On the other hand, the emails that went out about the company picnic, it's not really a big secret. It's not a big deal. There's no proprietary information there. If you're under regulation, let's say you're subject to HIPAA or any of the SEC regulations or any of the military specs, then you have to keep data a certain length of time, and there are certain requirements about backing it up and that sort of thing. So you need to know which data goes in which bucket, so to speak, so that your backups and therefore your recoveries can be done appropriately.
Once you've classified your data and applications, what do businesses need to know about retrieving consistent data or usable data from a recovery?
That's actually a really important point, because if you have what amounts to a partial restore, you can really get bitten, because if you have a partial restore that you maybe don't realize isn't a full restore, and you start putting information into the system, now you've got this gap of information in the system, and it can be very painful to go back and fix that. So you definitely need to have some checks and balances in there that, okay, I've done my restore, I've brought everything back up online, I've switched over to the other systems, whatever I'm going to do, now how do I make sure that it's accurate? And that's really a key point of the process.
Robbie, what's your take on this?
Having a consistent data or having a consistent backup is extremely important. You can do it in several different ways with snapshot technology on your storage system or with continuous data protection, because it's automatically there. You can journal it forward and backward to whatever point in time you want.
A great example is any kind of system such as Exchange or SQL Server where you have a database and you have logs. And the way these work at a high level is it writes the transaction in a log file, and then it makes the updates in the database at some moment later, not very long later typically, but that way you've got an audit trail of everything that happened. And if something happens to the database, you can simply replay the logs and rebuild whatever you lost. So the key there is keeping the database and the logs in a consistently synchronized or a consistent state where you get both the database and the logs at about the same time. If you get them out of sync, then what will happen is you'll either get a corrupt database when you go to replay everything, stuff won't work right, or it'll just be missing some things. And you don't want to be missing any transactions, whether they're emails or database updates, whatever they are. You want to make sure you've got everything. And so if you have a good real-time protection plan that makes sure it's got everything all the time, then you're in a consistent state.
And finally, what advice would you give our audience about putting recovery time and recovery point objectives to work in the real world?
Well, in a real-world disaster, you actually need to have started a little bit before the disaster happens, hopefully. So I would suggest that you start with the dreaded question of what can you afford to lose, and that's going to drive your objectives, both on the time frames and the processes and the recovery point objectives that you're putting in place. So once you've determined what you can afford to lose, that will drive what types of tools you have to have in place and what types of procedures.
Whether you're a system administrator or a reseller, you've got a customer. You need to sit down with your customer and talk to them about realistically what happens if you don't get their data back. You also have to talk to them about processing schedules. When can they afford to do things? You have to talk about the technology that's available, and then you have to come up with a realistic figure. Most companies can afford to lose a minute or two. Some can afford to lose an hour. But once you get past that hour, it usually starts to get extremely painful. You also, on the flip side, have to talk about how long it takes to recover. If it's going to take you 2 or 3 days to recover, I would really hate to be in your shoes.
You always have to test recovery, and it's better to test it when things are calm and you're not in a crisis, because when crisis situations happen, other things come into play.
Well, it all comes down to process and planning. Once you have your RPOs and RTOs, you have to put it down on paper. You actually have to make the plan or to reach those objectives.
To recap, it's not enough to simply lay out a plan on paper for meeting recovery time and recovery point objectives. To minimize downtime and data loss in a real-world situation, it's crucial to plan before disaster strikes. As our experts discussed, this plan includes classifying your data and applications, setting internal expectations for RTOs and RPOs, and testing your plan. This way, you can provide a solid solution to meet the recovery needs of your business as a whole. Thank you to our team of experts for today's discussion. And thank you for watching Experts and Insights, brought to you by Backbone Software.